Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business, and in this episode, geomorphology, behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guests today are both from the UK's National Oceanography Centre. That's Isobel Yeo, researcher in Geology and Volcanology, and Michael Clare, principal researcher of ocean BioGeoscience. Usually on this podcast, if we refer to the physical layer, it would be to layer 1 in the OSI model. But today we're going to talk about the actual physical layer, as in the ocean floor, fault lines, volcanoes, and things like that. You see, Mike and Izzy are geologists specializing on the seafloor, so their research has become vital for the submarine cable community. While most cable faults are due to human activity like fishing and anchors, as we will discuss, a fair number relate to changes on the floor of the ocean, including earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, and even flooding on land, which was certainly news to me, as you will hear. We discuss the myriad ways that the dynamic nature of what lies under the surface of the ocean can damage submarine cables both in the short and long term. We even get into the history of natural disasters and communications cables going back a century or more. As a geographer, I was particularly fascinated by how little we actually know about the ocean floor itself, despite the fact that, of course, water covers 70% of the Earth's surface. And Mike and Izzy even get into ways that submarine cables can help us provide additional data about the ocean floor to increase our knowledge of this dark world. We do talk about a specific event, which is what led them to be on the podcast, having talked about this at a suboptic conference. That is the Tongan volcanic eruption, as well as ongoing threats to submarine cables, including how climate change could increase these risks and how we might start to mitigate them. So it was a great learning experience for me, and I think it will be for you or anyone interested in the global telecom space. Enjoy! All right, welcome to the show, Mike and Izzy.
Hi, how you doing?
All right, it's wonderful to have you guys on. This is going to be really fun for me because I'm usually talking to people who work directly in the internet and all that kind of stuff, and I've got a couple of geologists on the call, so that's really cool. So, could you just both in turn give a brief background on yourselves and what you're doing here?
After you, Izzy.
Oh, okay. Well, hello, my name's Isobel Yeo. I'm a geologist and volcanologist at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, and my expertise is in volcanology.
Excellent.
Yep. And I'm Mike Clare. I'm also a geologist at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK. I study slightly different things. I study things like underwater landslides, avalanches of sand and mud, I think that we'll probably get onto. And since 2019, I've also been working with the International Cable Protection Committee as their marine environmental advisor. So that's pretty much how I kind of got involved with anything to do with subsea cables.
Excellent. All right. Yeah. And that brings us to why you're on a podcast about the internet, right? So I want to just, start with the very basics. So definitely most people who listen to the show are well familiar with the world of submarine cables. They follow telegeography, but they might not be that familiar with the causes of a lot of submarine cable breaks. Everybody knows it's not sharks. But a lot of people are aware that, occasionally you're going to have anchors and stuff like that. You guys are focusing on the rest of it. What is that is the danger to submarine cables?
Yeah, and it's a good question because maybe more than 3/4 of faults for subsea cables, the kind of 200 to 300 that happen each year on the annual network, relate, as you know, to interactions with fishing gear or accidental anchor drops. So most of the attention gets paid there. Every so often something happens, something big, something geological, which is kind of where we get interested, where perhaps multiple cables can be damaged by one event almost instantaneously. I think depending on which statistics you look at, between less than 10 or 20% of cable faults worldwide relate to what we call kind of geological events or geological processes. And geology usually means over thousands or millions of years, but these are kind of movements of the earth or changes, things like earthquakes or underwater landslides. And I guess ever since cables have been laid, there have been events like this that have impacted the relatively small diameter cables and caused damage. Natural hazards. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, just to interrupt, it's a really good point, I think, to sort of focus in on, which is that the sort of human-caused breaks of submarine cables, except for in a very few sort of bottleneck kind of areas, are very likely to only impact maybe a single cable, whereas these, even if it's only 10 or 20%, these geologic events are likely to potentially impact many cables at once.
Absolutely. So you could look at the footprint of some events that historically have been attributed to damaging cables. Take examples like offshore southwest Taiwan, where some of the biggest tropical storms landfall. This has a huge impact for land-based infrastructure because of the high winds, but the huge amount of water that falls during those massive rainfall events flushes down through rivers. It sends all that sand and mud offshore and can create avalanches of sand and mud, things we call turbidity currents, that can run through underwater canyons. And where cables cross those canyons, they can cause damage to those cables, causing abrasion or breaks to them. And the footprint of those tropical cyclones can be, in some cases, as big as the main islands of Japan. Right. So multiple cable systems can be damaged almost at the same time, meaning that repairs are necessary because you can't reroute data through adjacent cables if they're all damaged.
Man, that is fascinating. So we're not even talking about, we're going to get to, especially from you, Izzy, a really dramatic one in the Tog example. We're not necessarily talking about these dramatic earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, but even just, a really hard rain, not to sort of underplay what a cyclone or a hurricane can be like, but even something like that, just like a lot of water flowing in can cause the seafloor to move around and damage cables. I truly did not know that until this moment. So that's really cool.
No, I guess kind of nestled in those fault data. I mean, Izzy's been looking into work on a global basis, but particularly in places like the Caribbean, on just the interactions of currents that happen on the seabed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it doesn't even have to be an event. It can be a long-term process. So where you have regions, say with extremely rough seafloor, you've got a lot of rocks, a lot of gravel, stuff that's quite inhospitable. If you have a cable that lays particularly at an angle to a prevailing sort of current direction, over time you can get abrasion on those cables, you can get chafe on those cables, and you can sometimes get suspension if you get winnowing underneath. So it's not even that you necessarily need an event. Sometimes there are just environmental sort of circumstances that are also pretty inhospitable for seafloor infrastructure, I suppose.
It's almost like when you drop something in the sea, it's not just disappearing, but there's a whole world and ecosystem and everything under there as well as above the ground, right?
So, yeah, that might be the take-home message from today.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely think that is, and it's one of the things that really got me interested in cables, because the deep sea, covers most of our planet, and we know so little about it because it's hard to go there. It's hard to make measurements there. So any measurements we get, any evidence that we're able to acquire is extremely valuable scientific information. So when cables start breaking in the deep sea in places where maybe we didn't expect it in the first place, it tells us that the deep sea is a far more interesting and dynamic place than we thought it would have been.
Right.
So when cables break, it's not that we're delighted, but it does mean that we're starting to learn something else about an area that we maybe didn't have any data, we didn't have any opportunities to make measurements. So
yeah, you have the flashlight shining at that particular place, whereas there's a huge ocean out there. It's really hard to sort of pinpoint other things, right?
Yeah, you got to pick a place, and cables have to pick a place, and sometimes it's not the right place at that particular point in time.
And I think we often don't realize quite how much we don't know about the deep sea as well. We're used to being able to track ourselves within a few meters with a mobile phone, or use 3 words to figure out where we are. And then things happen in the oceans, planes go missing and vessels disappear and all sorts of things happen. And we just don't have the same level of observation in the oceans as we have other places. And that's both bad, in terms of understanding what some hazards might be, but also it means that cables give us a real insight into that.
Yeah, so I want to talk about sort of the start of this. So again, a lot of people familiar with telegeography's work will know, because we've talked a lot about this, about the history of submarine cables and going way back to the telegraph days. But I take it that there's a history of faults with submarine cables that is worth looking into as well. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so this all goes way back, right, to the late 1800s. Is as the first cables were laid. Some of the first surprises about the ocean, the fact that there's a ridge in the middle of the Atlantic, were discovered when the first telegraph cables were laid, and those early routes didn't last very long until they needed to be repaired. And some aspects of that just relates to abrasion, to lessons learned in how you design and build a telegraph cable. But way back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it was discovered off West Africa that cables that were laid across the mouth of the Congo River — this is the second biggest river in the world in terms of the water it discharges — they kept snapping. And so those cables kept breaking. Then a few years later, in 1929, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake off the coast of Newfoundland. And all the cables that connected North America to the United Kingdom snapped. Not exactly at the same time, they snapped one by one.
Mm-hmm.
And by looking at the times and the distances between those cable breaks, scientists actually maybe 30 years later were able to reconstruct that sequence of events to show that a massive underwater landslide was triggered by that earthquake. It started to mix with the seawater as it went down the slope and created something like a snow avalanche, but made out of sand and mud. And that traveled about 800 kilometers into the deep sea on the sorts of angles of slopes that are the drainage angle on like a Premier League football pitch. But we were able to work out how fast these things went. So to recognize that maybe they went up to 20 meters per second.
Wow.
And previously, people thought this was a very boring place, the deep sea. The idea that kind of deep waters run still was really kind of kicked into touch by these first ever measurements of these flows. And these things have continued to happen. In some cases, they're relatively rare events. A repeat event of that Grand Banks event from 1929 off Newfoundland would be quite significant for the internet connection between North America and the UK. But these events, they happen on the order of every 100 years, every 1,000 years. So maybe we haven't experienced another one. Maybe we won't in the next 30, 50, 100 years. Who knows? But in other places like the Congo Canyon that extends offshore Angola and West Africa, there is a history of multiple cable breaks as a result of these avalanches. So we know that some systems, submarine canyons, which are a bit like the rivers of the deep sea, some of these systems can be extremely active with multiple flows per year. But without the cable breaks, we wouldn't necessarily have known this.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, there's a certain to extent which we take for granted, or at least nerds like me, that you can go into Google Earth and you can see where all the sort of plates meet up and all the ridge lines in the ocean and that sort of thing. We had no idea any of that was even there, even just a few decades ago, basically, right? So.
Yeah, and and some of the first scientific observations in the ocean come from those early cable routes. The first evidence of complex life in the deep sea came in the late 1800s from first dredges of samples from the middle of the Atlantic. The fundamentals of plate tectonics, the fact that we do have these kind of plate contacts that spread in the middle of the ocean, they exist. And I guess to these days, we're discovering volcanoes that we never knew on the seafloor.
Yes, exactly. So I think that cues us up very well for this paper. So the reason that I got you guys on the show was that my colleague Tim Strong was at the Suboptic conference and saw you guys present this Tonga paper. So remind listeners, because I think a lot of people listening to the show would be familiar with the event, but just as a reminder, what happened in Tonga and what happened to the cables there?
Yeah, so I'll do that.
Please,
so the Tonga eruption was quite newsworthy eventually, but it didn't start that way. So the main bit of the eruption people have heard about is a really large explosive event on January the 15th, 2022. And that was like the most explosive volcanic eruption that we've had in about 150 years. So really comparable with like major global events over the last sort of bit of recorded history, really. And it was a huge event, but actually the eruption started quite a lot before that. It started on the 20th of December the previous year. And the volcano that was involved, we call it Hunga Volcano. It's also sometimes called Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai, which is the name of the island.
I'm not going to have to repeat that, am
I? Yes, you are.
It's not as bad as the Iceland one from a few years back, right? So
I spent a lot of time practicing saying that, actually. So yeah, it's hard to say. We're going to use Hunga Volcano, though, which is actually the correct name.
All right.
But it's part of a string of different volcanoes in that area they're there because it's a subduction zone. So we've got one tectonic plate going underneath another one. And because of that, we have what's called a volcanic arc. And this region of sort of the ocean is extremely volcanically active. There's about 70, 80 known volcanoes in that area. And over the last 5 years, there's been almost one eruption a year. And typically they're pretty small. And that's exactly how this event started. So we use a thing called volcanic explosivity index to describe volcanic eruptions, which is basically how much stuff came out of them and how quickly. And usually they're pretty low, 1 or 2. So, they're volcanic eruptions, they're still dangerous, but they're not global events. But this eruption in Tonga, while it started off a VEI, sort of 1 or 2, it ended up being a 5, which is a really, really major explosive event.
Gotcha. It's a tight scale then.
It goes from not very much to quite a lot very quickly. And it had huge impact. So this very, very explosive event on January the 15th, it sent shockwaves around the world 4 times. It generated tsunamis both in the Pacific but also in other oceans related to that shockwave. It caused a load of different impacts on the seafloor. The sort of area in the middle we call Hunger volcano a caldera, which means it's got a big wide depression in the middle. The depth of that went from about 100 meters to about 900 meters. So it blew almost 6 cubic kilometers of material out of the crater in the middle. So it left a big hole in the middle. It generated pyroclastic flows. So all kinds of different sort of typical volcanic hazards associated with volcanic eruptions on land, but happening in the ocean, which is a bit more of a complicated process. Because you can't observe it, so you don't really know what's going on. You don't want to be super close to those eruptions. Usually, you don't want to be sort of proximal in a boat because you will be killed. So we don't have any direct observations. So what we have to do to try and reconstruct that, because you also can't see it from satellites because there's a big umbrella cloud associated with it, is to use sort of reports from land and from people to try and reconstruct what happened. And that's what's happened with some of the tsunami stuff. But the other thing that happened in this eruption, which was sort of very unfortunate for Tongan communities, but quite fortunate from a scientific perspective, was that there are 2 subsea cables there, so 2 telecommunication cables that go one along the sort of southern side of the volcano and one along the east, one which connects the islands and Tonga together, so their domestic cable, and one which connects Tonga to the rest of the world. So their international cable. And both of those cables were damaged really seriously in this eruption. So they were basically broken along really long sections of their length. And that was really bad for Tongan communities, because obviously in a time of disaster, the very last thing you want is your internet to go down. So it had a real sort of direct impact in terms of supplying aid, of understanding what had happened on different islands. But from a scientific perspective, it's quite useful because, again, it tells us about some of those subsea processes that otherwise we'd have no idea about, because we can't see through the top of the sea very easily. So those breaks happened sort of in quite quickly after the initial explosion. And I'll let Mike talk a little bit about speeds in a minute, because that's some work that we've been doing. But from that perspective, that was a really, really useful bit of information, because we've never been able to understand really where or how fast seafloor flows are going before. So that was something that was quite new in this eruption.
And the impact, not just cutting them off from the rest of the world, but even from each other, because they had a domestic cable, so there are multiple islands that can no longer communicate with each other very easily at all, right? So
yeah, exactly. And I mean, the Tongan Islands are quite isolated, and I think the more isolated you are, the more important communications are. And in this event, there was obviously a tsunami associated with it, and it was very hard to understand, even from Tongatapu, which is sort of the main island, what the impact of that had been on different islands. And there was like a really horrible few days where there was no idea how much damage had been done, whether or not lives had been lost. There was a really sort of spooky emergency signal just being emitted from one of the islands, but they couldn't make contact with it to figure out what had happened. And so that was really quite a difficult and traumatic time, I think, for families, because you couldn't figure out what had happened to other members of your families or friends in other places.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when you're talking to people outside the telecom industry, they always think that we're communicating via satellites and whatnot. Just to be clear, that like, satellite coverage for a place like Tonga would be very spotty, but I take it would also be difficult given that there's a bunch of material in the atmosphere, right? So
yeah, I mean, it was a challenging time all round, I think, because, I mean, the ashfall was also impacting local water supplies and a whole host of things. And the remoteness of the location of the Kingdom of Tonga from, say, where repair ships were stationed, the ship had to come from Papua New Guinea, so it's a decent steam to get there. You talked about that the breaks related to, say, anchor drops or fishing. And so another difference between the kind of natural hazards and those sorts of events, maybe they may damage one cable, maybe an anchor drag, you may be 1, 2, 3, and then the Navy gets involved and someone alerts the vessel.
Right.
In this instance, the cables were damaged between 89 and 105 kilometers length of these cables. So this is...
Oh, wow. So we're not talking like a little break that you can go and you just splice one sort of place, but huge segments of cable.
Exactly. So this is not the sort of length that you would typically have in hand locally for repair, and it's a reason why over a year now the domestic cable is still not repaired, still waiting for manufacture of appropriate cable.
Well, bad timing with sort of supply chain issues going on, and submarine cable ships were all sort of understaffed at that time too. I know from the rest of the industry. So
yeah, you certainly compound things against the background of a pandemic, and this often happens with natural hazards. It's not necessarily just the first thing that is the issue. There's multiple things that can happen concurrently. If you've got ashfall, you're cut off from communications, and you have the misfortune to also have a pandemic going on at the time. It really adds a lot of complications. But for us, when this event happened, the thing that really took us by surprise was, well, first of all, this volcano really exploded in a big way and suddenly went very rapidly. But the thing that caught us by surprise was the locations of these cable faults. So we initially thought, well, maybe this is to do with local landslides and slope failures of the flanks from around the volcano, because the distances that were involved were so big. The international cable is more than 70 kilometers away from the volcano. Well, I thought there's no way that this could be a kind of a flow on the seafloor that did it. It must be something else.
Right.
And so Izzy was really kind of catalyzed the proposal because she's a volcanologist and actually understands how these things work. And when we were able to get in with collaborators, so support from both Tonga Cable Limited and other collaborators through the International Cable Protection Committee, they helped us work a case towards the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK to get funds together to pay for a vessel to get out a couple of months after the eruption. So we had a detailed map of what the seafloor looked like before. And then with collaborators at NIWA in New Zealand and supported by the Nippon Foundation, we're able to get the first ever detailed before and after picture of what happens on the seafloor after a major eruption. And the results were mind-blowing. We were completely taken aback by what we saw.
So what was it that was surprising and unusual? The distance from the eruption that the breaks happened?
So several things were really, really quite surprising. First of all, the size of the hole that it blew in the middle was quite exciting.
Right, the caldera, you mean, in the volcano.
That's a pretty major seafloor change. But in terms of the cables, what we were expecting, you go in with a hypothesis when you write a scientific proposal because people like to see that. And what we thought had happened is that the event was so sort of large that it probably triggered little landslides from other volcanoes in the area, other slopes. And what we found actually was that isn't what had happened at all. That these cables were buried by these huge deposits, all of which were sourced from the volcano, and which had traveled tens or hundreds even kilometers away from it underwater. And what we saw was really, really thick deposits of material around the flanks of the volcano and further away. So in places, one of the areas where there's cable, there was tens of meters of material deposited on top of it, all of which
sitting on top of the cable, you mean, and that's enough to sort of crush it essentially from being able to work anymore.
Yeah, so it can crush it. It can move it around. Like cables they're not super. I mean, they're resilient, but if you hit them at several, tens or hundreds of kilometers with quite a large amount of gravel, most things will give way eventually. So it's not a huge surprise given the size of the flows that were hitting them that they were damaged. And then the other thing that was really interesting was that we saw multiple phases of this. So it wasn't just one single flow that came from the volcano that damaged all the cables. There were multiple pulses of material that were traveling really long way, really, really quickly, and intersecting these subsea cables and burying them. And we really hadn't expected to see that. We hadn't realised either the size of the flows that were going to be sort of caused by the volcanic eruption, nor in any way how far they'd travel or how big they'd be.
So what we have are these kind of like these incised chutes, like slides, right, on the side of the volcano, which is locally up to 40 degrees steep. that have carved into the bedrock, the volcanic bedrock, which is very competent.
Right.
They've in some places cut down kind of 100 meters deep
Wow.
into the bedrock. And as they hit the break-in slope at the bottom of the volcano, you can imagine that the slope changes quite abruptly. Where the cable is laid on the relatively smooth area of seafloor, suddenly they dump a lot of that material, so they just drop a lot of that gravelly stuff. But another part of the flow, like snow avalanches that continue running, in some cases like run up a valley,
Right.
they've circled around, gone along the length of the cable, and they've been steered around other underwater volcanoes, which have kind of basically sloshed around like a slide at the fairground as the flows have swung round and then finally hit the international cable. So we know from the timing from satellite observations and eyewitness observations that parts of this eruption cloud collapsed into the ocean, into things that Izzy's talked about that we call pyroclastic flows, these things that can run out very fast on land. We know very little about what happens when they go into the ocean. And there's a huge flux of very heavy and dense material that's piled its way into the water, down the steep slope of the volcano. And we know the time that those things went into the ocean. We know the time the cable breaks. So the first domestic cable broke about 15 minutes after. That gives us a speed of about up to 120 kilometers per hour that this flow was moving. So this is the fastest flow that anybody has ever recorded on the seafloor. So the poor cable didn't stand a chance. But the flow kept going. And by the time it reached the domestic cable, it was traveling at least 50 kilometers an hour and maybe even faster if a later flow was responsible for breaking it. We've also discovered that all the biology on the seafloor, bar in a few places, was either completely smothered or wiped out.
Right.
So this was a really profound event for a number of reasons. And there's just a few places behind some boulders where some organisms survived. And after this event, will have stepped out and said, guys, did you see that? And none of their friends are there anymore.
Yeah. Man. So you mentioned that this was, a 5 on a scale of 5 or something like that, like an unusual event, right? So
yeah, I mean the scale goes above 5. It's not, the level of like a
yeah,
Yellowstone style eruption.
Right,
but yeah.
right. So, but are there lessons for smaller events that you can draw from having gotten this good new data?
So this is something that Mike and I have talked about a little bit about resilience to volcanic eruptions. I think it's pretty difficult. For large eruptions like the one that we've just had, I mean, you're going to be, if you were going to try and sort of use a standoff distance, you'd be talking about hundreds of kilometers. And for events that are this rare, that's probably not worth doing.
Right.
What I think is probably more useful, I mean, is to understand obviously where volcanoes are, and we are doing a better job of mapping the oceans and of understanding them than we ever did before. But still quite a lot of work to be done. So in terms of mapping a route and understanding local hazards, that's really important. And again, the subsea cable industry is actually doing quite a lot of that mapping, which is good of it. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. But really, I think it's in terms of understanding where those hazards actually are. So for volcanic hazards, if you know where you're likely to experience high levels of activity, or understanding how much damage can be associated with a volcanic event, which is along tens or hundreds of kilometers of cable, having the facility to repair in those areas a little bit faster, or to have the materials available to carry out those kind of repairs, is probably the most resilient you can be. There's also a role that cables can play in terms of some of the new technologies that are being developed for monitoring. So we are looking into some of this with some very interesting different people. But in terms of what you can understand about how active volcanic arcs are and which volcanoes are the most active, by using things like distributed acoustic sensing through cables. So perhaps there's a bit of a feedback there where you can use the cables to understand what hazards they're potentially open to as well.
Yeah, I think that part is really fascinating. So we had talked before the show about how my background is geography, and I went to a school that was particularly focused on like remote sensing and LiDAR and stuff like that. We have a great deal of data about land cover, and what's going on. I wasn't even really aware of how we collect data about the seafloor. So maybe you could go a little bit deeper into that, especially the role that submarine cables might play with. Well, you'll have to explain it because I understand it very poorly with like rally scattering and stuff like that, right? So,
do you want to talk about multi-beam mapping, Izzy, and how we map the seafloor?
I could talk about mapping. So I think we should lead with the fact that neither Mike or I are experts in this at all. So we
Sure.
work with other people. Maybe
Mhm.
do a podcast on it because there are some really, really great, very interesting people that could talk about it.
I'm never an expert in anything I'm talking about, so
Yeah, I mean, multi-beam data, and I think a lot of people listening to your podcast will be very familiar with acquisition of multi-beam, but it involves bouncing sound off the seafloor to figure out how far away it is, and then correcting that for things like how complicated your water column is to produce a map of what the seafloor looks like. There are a couple of different things I think that are worth noting for that. We tend to use a statistic that only 20% of the oceans are mapped, and that really depends on what resolution you're thinking about. So that's a statistic that you hear a lot, but that's a relatively low resolution. So I think it's 150 meters as a grid size is what we've mapped 20% of the oceans at. It's not hugely helpful. It's better than nothing, but there are lots of different resolutions you can map at, and you can use lots of different pieces of equipment to do that. So what we are looking to move towards is sort of better coverage at higher resolution. But the other thing that we tend to do is we tend to map something once and assume that we've done it. And actually, as we've talked about already, the seafloor is a very dynamic place, so it's not stationary. It's not changing. And unless you do repeat mapping in the same areas, so unless you cover the same routes more than once, you won't necessarily understand how the seafloor is evolving either. So it's not just coverage that's important; it's repeat coverage, and that's a much harder case to make, I think, a lot of the time.
Right. It kind of reminds me of that old joke, where the guy who had too many drinks lost his keys on the street, and he's looking around the street lamp. Another guy comes up. And he's like, "Well, where were you when you lost him?" He's like, "Oh, I was over there by that alley, but here's where the light is." Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Totally. I mean, thinking about future opportunities or improvements, typically multi-beam surveys are required before you lay a cable. If there has been an instance of damage, it's quite rare that multi-beam surveys are required to try and diagnose exactly what's happened. So here's a relatively rare instance where that has happened. And, many cable repair vessels don't have, a hydrographer and a multi-beam system, at least one that's operational most of the time.
Right.
So in many of these instances, we might be able to learn a lot more about future resilience and finding maybe the least worst place if there is an area that's kind of particularly hazardous that has to be crossed by gaining those new data. The things we definitely could have learned from this sort of eruption, but we didn't have the data to do, was to try and understand what the precursor conditions were in the build-up to it really going bang. Izzy says it kind of took us by surprise, but if we'd had monitoring data like we do for other volcanoes, like Mount Etna, for example, or Yellowstone and other places that are onshore or in well-instrumented places, we'd be able to get some handle on what do the signals look like, how do they change before the thing went, so you could get a better early warning out. And
Right.
Tonga, Fiji, these sorts of areas, they're challenging places because they're island nations with a lot of sea and a lot of volcanoes in between. So the ability to turn seafloor cables into sensors themselves is really exciting. And so this doesn't now, because of technological advances, it doesn't necessitate the installation of smart nodes or new sensors to them. This is using the optical fiber that lies at the heart of a modern telecoms cable, and potentially along a data carrying fiber or a dark fiber. So tools like distributed acoustic sensing, which look at basically the reflections of light within the cable to pinpoint precisely where a fault has occurred or where something else has happened. So maybe a perturbation like an earthquake, a volcanic activity on the seafloor has happened. State of polarization and interferometry, which basically look at changes to the signal that you put into the cable, and then as it comes back out, you look to see how it's changed. And we can relate that to different events or processes. In some cases, that might be interactions with fishing gear, but the stuff that we're really interested in is turning these cables into basically seismic monitoring networks.
Right.
So we can hear ground motions from earthquakes. We can pick up the rumbling before a volcano actually erupts. And this would provide useful information ahead of time. It might not stop a cable fault from happening, but might allow you to identify a time window within which it could. But it also provides useful information to coastal communities to say, a potential tsunami-genic event could be happening.
Right.
And it would mean that we wouldn't be caught by surprise by these sorts of events. It kind of seems totally inappropriate in this day and age with the technology that we have, that we're caught by surprise by these sorts of events that can be so damaging to coastal communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it seems like a real happy accident that we've covered the Earth and submarine cables for essentially the commercial interests of building the internet, but that it could be used to save lives in a natural disaster, essentially.
Yeah, and there's lots of challenges, and this technology is still quite new.
Hmm.
And there's a whole host of challenges as well. Potential kind of legal obstructions. Does it represent a kind of a different use of cables? I think in this case not, because you're using the cable itself. You're using the
Hmm.
optical fiber, and you're not changing its purpose. It's still able to transmit data traffic.
Right. And Izzy, did you have something to add there?
No, I think Mike pretty much covered everything I was going to say. The only thing I had to add was that we think again that we are monitoring the Earth, but we're not really. And if you had a major active volcano on land near to a population center, you'd have a full set of instrumentation. I mean, most of them have a volcano observatory, but as soon as that volcano is underwater, even by a few meters,
Right.
there's basically very little monitoring at all. There are almost no cabled observatories for volcanoes, and there is very little remote observation technology that's capable of providing real monitoring. So it's not surprising that we're surprised when those volcanoes erupt, but maybe we shouldn't be, and maybe we should be thinking about ways we can provide warnings to particularly to island communities, which are particularly vulnerable, especially in regions where those hazards are likely to be compounded by other things like climate change,
Right.
and particularly in areas where they are unlikely to have a GDP that's going to allow them to put in things like cabled instrumentation. If we can
Hmm.
use telecommunication cables to provide monitoring, I think that's a real sort of service to mankind.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I think it's certainly worth saying that maybe this was a 1 in 1,000 year event for this particular volcano, but there's many more volcanoes along the arc. But generally, you know, cable companies avoid volcanoes where they can.
Right. Yes,
Because
exactly.
it's got gnarly irregular terrain. Quite often there's kind of a richness of biodiversity that you don't want to disturb. So
Hmm.
for a number of reasons you avoid them. But in certain regions,
Where
particularly on
people
volcanic,
live right near
when
them,
people
then
live
you might,
on a
yeah.
volcanic island, then
Hmm.
there's no way to avoid it.
Right.
So you need to bite the bullet on that front. But still, the number of faults, you could count on a couple of hands probably that are attributed to volcanoes since records begin.
Hmm. Hmm.
The thing that's changing, and we're looking particularly over like a 25 to 30 year design life for a cable, obviously different cables, different routes will vary, um, is climate. The,
Right.
the
Right.
climate is changing, and the external threats that cables and landing stations face will change, and that is not going to be uniform geographically. So, as
Hmm.
Izzy said, it's probably not just the one hazard you want to think about, it's multiple hazards. And even fishing is something which people don't think about within the context of climate change.
Hmm.
But as the oceans warm, fish are moving towards higher latitudes.
Mm.
By several degrees is forecast over the next decades. So that means that areas that maybe previously weren't commercially fished may well be in future. And
Right.
so cables in those areas that were not designed or buried to withstand fishing may become exposed to that sort of external threat.
Hmm.
But climate change, it affects us all, but it is now affecting things like coastal erosion at landing stations. It's
Right.
affecting the intensity degree of seafloor currents and things like the tropical cyclones that we talked about at the beginning in Taiwan. We're seeing that their focus is shifting poleward, so
Right.
towards the south in Taiwan, that their intensity is changing, they're slowing, there's more rainfall. So things that used to maybe be 1 in 100 year events are becoming 1 in 30 year events in those sorts of areas.
Hmm.
And 1 in 30 year event is the sort of thing you care more about if your design life is 30 years.
Right. 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 So we need to start thinking differently about sort of mitigation of these risks, especially as climate change will increase or change them. How do you work with the submarine cable community to say, this is best practices to avoid these kind of risks? Like, obviously, you go and do things like speak at suboptic, but is there a sort of recursive relationship going on?
Yeah, so I view this as very much like a virtuous circle. That
Mm.
the thing that really got me interested in the subsea cable industry, apart from the fact that like natural hazards have damaged the infrastructure and we're learning stuff, was it strikes me there's a very collegiate atmosphere and there's a willingness to share information.
Hmm.
So whilst there might be sensitivities around precise locations of individual cable systems, but it's an industry that's always been keen to learn from things that haven't worked out.
Right.
So all the way back to cable breaks in the early 1900s, there's been a move to say, right, well, if it doesn't work there, let's move somewhere else. And data have been shared with scientists and with academics to then say, well, we don't understand the process. Can you understand the process? And then feed that back to us so we can design, more appropriate routes. So organizations like the International Cable Protection Committee, on an annual basis, publish a list of cable repair times and look on a kind of a regional to national basis, and also within areas beyond national jurisdiction of where cables are damaged, to try and then learn from that. So we can use those sorts of databases to track trends such as climate change forced impacts on subsea cables.
Right.
And so I think a real strength of the collaboration there is a willingness to share that information, the instances of damage, and then to listen back. It's also worth saying that the industry itself is very cognizant and aware of things like climate change. So
right.
the ICPC has a position statement on climate change that recognizes it's a real thing and it's happening now. It will change in the future, and has commissioned research alongside funding from said research councils in the UK that Izzy and I have benefited from, to try and identify, where are the hotspots of climate change impacts likely to be in future.
Yeah, that brings up a good point that I wanted to focus on a little bit, would be that you guys work for the UK government, but that there's an interest here from not just global governments, from large countries to small. Even a very large country like the US has the potential to lose a significant amount of communications, even if it's not cut off the way that a Tonga kind of country, island geography would be. But is there any opportunity to get the industry itself interested in sort of funding this work, in making sure that all of the data are exchanged in a sort of neutral platform, that kind of thing?
So some aspects of that are already undergoing. So several cable companies, survey companies, are sharing data through the Seabed 2030 initiative. So the idea to try and have mapped the entirety of the ocean by 2030.
Oh, wow.
And because cable routes are going into frontier areas where no one's been before, those data are the first of their kind. So they're contributing towards that. In terms of funding this work, I guess often it happens on not a needs must basis, but as and when there is an issue, then there's an opportunity to fund things. We're certainly also kind of open to collaborations to try and identify issues before they're issues. And that's particularly relevant within the area of climate change. And that's certainly where support from ICPC has been very helpful, trying to think about where might those future hotspots of climate change hazards be.
Yeah, I mean, even to your earlier point, Izzy, that planning for having more local ability to repair should be more cost effective for the cable owners, right, than commissioning a ship from tens of thousands of kilometers away, so that there are things they can do here, exchanging data with you guys that might make them essentially more profitable even, right?
I mean, yes, that's the ultimate aim, and hopefully the research we do is useful. But yes, I think so. By identifying where those risks are likely to manifest in the future and how they're likely to change and what the scale of the kind of damage they're likely to cause is, then I think that, we can inform things in order to improve at least, cost effectiveness. Hopefully that results in profit. And also to identify, I think, it's not just repairs, it's sort of planning for the future as well. So with new routes, you maybe don't want to put your cable landing station and switch to a land-based fiber within a couple of meters of sea level, because if you start getting storm surges and stuff, then that whole bit of infrastructure is at risk. So from that side as well, I think some of the research that we do is quite useful, particularly in terms of identifying where that is. And a lot of that data exists. It's actually publicly available, but it's really quite impenetrable. If you want to go and download some of those models, it's quite hard to do without the right sort of bits of script and the right code. So turning some of that more complicated climate prediction data into products that are usable by industry, I think, is probably useful.
Right. Just the consumption of the data, and probably there's complex models and all that sort of thing to get through, but that what they would be looking for is just like, well, tell me what where I need to be, or what geographies are the most vulnerable and that sort of thing, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, excellent. All right. So I've really learned a lot here, so I appreciate you guys a lot for doing this. Ultimately, what do you think the call to action is for the industry? I mean, that's what we've been talking about. But if you had the opportunity to sort of like, have their ear and say, this is what you need to really think about over the next, say, 3 to 5 years, what is top of mind for you guys?
So I think quite a lot about the spectrum of events that could impact cables. So there's certainly things that you can deal with. You can protect for burial, you can bury for protection for fishing activity. You can engage with local fishers to help them understand what the potential impacts are and how to come to kind of a shared agreement on using the seabed.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a conversation with a volcano
Right.
or a submarine landslide. There's a compelling need to gather more data to understand the granularity of the seabed. And so that's to capture data really to fill the gaps of what we're missing. As Izzy said, maybe 20, 30% of the seafloor is mapped in detail.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to start closing those gaps, and there's an opportunity to do that collectively between researchers and industries such as subsea telecommunications. In terms of resilience, I'm always amazed when we look at areas that are tectonically, seismically, volcanically active, actually quite how resilient the network is, how few cable faults there are due to natural hazards. So there are a whole range of events which are relatively small, which don't damage cables, and I'd love to learn more about those. What sets the threshold above which you actually get damage and above which you care? Because some of those other processes are important for a host of other reasons. But a cable fault is a binary thing. It tells you did break or didn't break. We don't know about the things, as Izzy talked about, things like abrasion and chafe due to seafloor currents, the things which are the kind of slow nibbling things which might lead you to failure over several years.
Right.
And I think it's those things that are going to be emphasized and exaggerated by future climate change. They're the things that might take us by surprise in future that we should be thinking about. But thinking about this spectrum of a 1 in 1,000 year massive volcano, it's quite a hard thing to design for. So maybe in certain areas you have distinct mitigation measures. In other places, think about the kind of the slow creeping issues that might just change over years or decades. One glove's not going to fit all, and it's going to be very different depending on the region you are in. So trying to understand that context, I think, is the important thing. And to understand context, we need data.
That's really interesting, almost like a reverse survivor bias kind of situation where the ones that break and break the worst get the attention, but that there are long-term sort of like problems that could lead to faults, but just in a much more gradual fashion. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add to what I think was a really good summary there by Mike is also understanding how those different things interact. We tend to look at individual events in terms of a single cause, but there are lots of different complex interactions in global Earth systems. And so you may get progressive damage or progressive vulnerability of cables due to a combination of factors, and understanding how those are all linked together, how climate's going to impact other factors, I think, again, is another way that we can plan for the future.
Right. Absolutely. Last time I checked, telecom equipment doesn't like to be wet. So that's an easy one to start there. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, like I said, guys, this was really fascinating. I much appreciate your time, especially I know, Izzy, you're on your way out for a long trip there. So I'm glad that we got you on before you had to go out. Listeners that want to keep up with you guys, try to catch you obviously at Suboptic, where I heard you gave some great talk, but how can listeners follow along with what you're doing?
Well, we'll be at conferences coming up. We'll be at European Subsea Cables Association. We'll be at Submarine Networks EMEA in London. You can check us on our website on noc.ac.uk to see what's going on more broadly in the areas of ocean research.
We're on Twitter.
We're on Twitter. Yeah.
Yes. I am so thankful that I'm not, but many of our listeners are.
Yes, we're on Twitter for as long as it lasts.
Yes, exactly. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much to both of you. This was great fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It was a real joy.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, my pleasure. Cheers. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.